Yesterday, the Senate had an opportunity to affirm our commitment to the dignity of human life. We had a chance to state plainly that newborn babies who happen to have survived an abortion are entitled to the same legal protections and professional care as other newborns. In all honesty, the fact that this legislation even needed to be written is a sad reminder of the degree to which our society is at risk of losing some crucial moral bearings. And the fact that the United States Senate could not even vote to advance this bill is beyond dismaying. The legislation was silent on the abortion issue. All it would have done was affirm the rights of these newborn babies. But apparently even that was a bridge too far. Not just for the far left fringe, not anymore, but now a bridge too far for the vast majority of our Democratic colleagues right here in the Senate. We're no longer dealing with a normal, traditional Democratic Party. We're looking at a party that has been dragged so far to the left, it would have been unrecognizable to folks just a few years ago. In 1996, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan condemned partial birth abortion by comparing it to infanticide. That was a distinguished, mainstream Democratic senator from New York about 20 years ago. And today, 94% of Senate Democrats could not even vote to protect babies after they're born. After they're born. And the only explanations they could offer were bizarre euphemisms and vague references to issues that have no bearing once a child has already been born alive. So it was a sorry display, Madam President. But I can say this fight isn't over. Republicans will not let this stunning extremism from our Democratic colleagues be the last word on this subject. Now, in another matter, fortunately, the Senate did make progress in another area. Yesterday, we advanced what will be the 31st Circuit Court nomination confirmed so far during the Trump administration. As I discussed yesterday, Eric Miller has a distinguished record in both public service and private practice. He holds degrees from Harvard and the University of Chicago, and his legal experience includes prestigious clerkships on our nation's highest courts. But rather than take my word for it, I would urge my colleagues to consider the endorsements of those with whom the nominee has studied and worked. For example, 54 members of the University of Chicago Law School class of 1999 with wide-ranging views on politics and judicial philosophy have offered a ringing endorsement for Eric Miller. In a letter to our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, they cite Mr. Miller's, quote, diligent work ethic, his keen legal mind, and his deep consideration for every legal issue he confronts. All in all, his classmates, many of whom have also been his colleagues over the years, say that Mr. Miller is, quote, extraordinarily well qualified to serve as a federal judge. I would urge each of my colleagues to join me in voting to confirm this fine nominee soon. Now, in a final matter, Madam President, anyone who's been attentive to the news these past few days has learned about the complete debacle that unfolded in last November's election for North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. Soon after Election Day, allegations of illegal ballot harvesting and vote tampering clouded a close result. The wrongdoing seemed to have benefited the Republican candidate over the Democrat. Just last week, we saw the State Board of Elections unanimously call for a new election. Now, Madam President, for years and years, every Republican who dared to call for common sense safeguards for Americans' ballots was demonized by Democrats and their allies. We were hit with left-wing talking points insisting that voter fraud wasn't real. Never happens, they said. Well, that fraud just didn't happen. That modest efforts to ensure that voters who are who they say they are and are voting in the proper place were really some sinister right-wing plot to prevent people from voting. So now, as you might expect, now that an incident of very real voter fraud has become national news and the Republican candidate seems to have benefited, these long-standing Democratic talking points have been really quiet. Haven't heard much lately from Democrats about how fraud never happens. They've gone silent. Now some are singing a different tune. Now there's a new interest in ensuring the sanctity of American elections. I've been focused for decades on protecting the integrity of elections. So I'd like to welcome my friends on the left to their new realization. They've just discovered that this subject really matters. But I've yet to see any evidence, Madam President, they're actually interested in cleaning up the conditions that leads to messes like this one in North Carolina. At the root of the North Carolina debacle is a practice that's known as ballot harvesting. Essentially, it's a means by which campaign representatives can collect absentee ballots on the premise of delivering them to a polling place or election office. That's what ballot harvesting is. So think about it. Who in American politics keeps long lists of potential voters? Who mobilizes networks of people to go door to door? Who funds and stands up these kinds of canvassing organizations? Who does those things? Madam President, I'm sorry to say they are not huge teams of politically neutral Eagle Scouts roving the country, hoping to use ballot harvesting to politely make voters' lives more convenient. This is not an Eagle Scout activity. No, the folks who really lick their lips at the prospect of mass ballot harvesting are political operatives, of course. Political operatives, interest groups, and one-sided political machines. This is why many jurisdictions, including North Carolina, have outlawed the practice altogether. Say that again. Many jurisdictions, including North Carolina, have outlawed this practice altogether. Ballot harvesting threatens to change the nature of our representative democracy. Forget about persuading people and spurring them to turn out to the polls. This practice makes elections a kind of scavenger hunt to see which side's operatives can return to headquarters with the most ballots in the trunks of their cars. And once those operatives take a hold of these ballots, the voters have no way to keep tabs on whether they were ever delivered. Now, of course, a system that invites political operatives to be rewarded for turning up ballots will open the door to misbehavior. Remember, it's illegal in North Carolina and most states for the obvious reason. But I've noted with interest the Democrats' new focus on this practice is yet to extend to California. I wonder why. Well, in California, Madam President, it's legal. It's a common practice in California. California allows anyone, not just family members, anyone, to show up at a polling place on election day with ballots that are not theirs. Welcome to California. Reports suggest that Orange County alone saw, listen to this, 250,000 absentee ballots dropped off on election day last year. 250,000 absentee ballots dropped off on election day. The county's registrar told a newspaper that some individuals dropped off hundreds hundreds of other people's ballots. And we have no way to know if those ballots were sealed or even voted when they were harvested. The only evidence we have that the voter cast his or her ballot is the signature. Now, this past election cycle turned out favorably for California Democrats, amazingly enough. These late arriving ballots seemed to help turn several races their way. Maybe this helps explain why. When House GOP leaders expressed concern over ballot harvesting in California, the state's Democrat Secretary of State mocked their concern by saying, what they call strange and bizarre, we call democracy. And now ballot harvesting has thrown out an election result in the U.S. House of Representatives. Legal in California, illegal in North Carolina. So maybe that helps explain why, as it stands, the Democrat Politician Protection Act, Speaker Pelosi's massive new federal takeover of the way states and communities run their elections, contains no effort whatsoever to crack down on ballot harvesting. Not in there. Instead, it contains provision after provision that would erode the protections that are supposed to ensure votes reflect the voice of the voter whose name is on the envelope. It contains provision after provision that would erode the protections that are supposed to ensure votes reflect the voice of the voter whose name is on the envelope. Provision after provision would erode common sense protections and bring the guardrails down. So would a serious reform bill aim to take away states' abilities to impose meaningful ID or signature requirements for voters? Would someone concerned about restoring democracy dismiss signature verification as an obstacle to be removed? I don't think so. Perhaps, Madam President, these facts signal that Democrats see a political advantage in eroding common sense protections and would rather keep that advantage than make episodes like the North Carolina mess less likely to happen in the future. An example of real, live voter fraud is staring the country right in the face right now in North Carolina. And yet Democrats choose at this moment to propose a sprawling federal takeover of election law that would erode the integrity of our elections even further. So that, Madam President, I think pretty well underscores what the priorities of today's Democrat Party is.